This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional world. Reaching those goals often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication that boils down complex topics to capture the attention of decision makers and general audiences. If you are interested in getting a free resource to help you do that, go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down, but never dumb down, complicated science and technical topics to key stakeholders. I'm so pleased to welcome Kumar Garg to the show today. Kumar is the Vice President of Partnerships at Schmidt Futures. In this role, Kumar works to help all major Schmidt Futures programs find successful leverage, as well as helping to run the technology and society portfolio. Kumar previously helped shape science and technology policy for the Obama administration for nearly 8 years, serving in a variety of roles in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. As a senior leader at OSTP, Kumar was involved in policy development, implementation, and communication of a wide range of science and technology issues. Prior to his time in government, Kumar worked on behalf of parents and children seeking educational reform as an education lawyer and advocate. He earned a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College and a law degree from Yale Law School. Welcome to the show, Kumar.
Thank you for having me. This is awesome.
It's so great. You've got such a rich experience, and I'm so ready to ask you about your perspective and your different experiences. Your first job out of college was as Deputy Communications Manager on presidential candidate Howard Dean's campaign in New Hampshire, which was a huge moment in American politics. What did the rough and tumble world of national politics teach you about communication?
It was quite a transformative job for me. I'm an immigrant to this country. I came in middle school and because of college. And I went to college in New Hampshire. And because New Hampshire is full of people running for president, the presidential primary was in full swing. I actually caught the political bug and saw the political system up close. And it made me really interested in potentially doing that. I studied political science and computer science back in college. And so I was one of those people who everyone else had their jobs kind of figured out as we were leaving college. And I was one of those people who was like, I really want to work on the presidential. And I couldn't figure out how to actually pull that off. But I was able to get myself an interview with then communications director for Howard Dean for New Hampshire, Dory Clark. And even though I had no background, really, I could write well and I was, willing to work really hard. She said, okay. She gave me a couple of writing samples. She's big on actually show your ability to communicate by writing it down. And she gave me the offer. It was one of those things where I learned more in those 9 months than I think I probably learned in multiple years afterwards. Part of it was when I joined, the campaign was still pretty small. It was right at that summer point. He had just been starting to get a lot. This all feels like Asian history people who don't remember, but he had become this kind of anti-war candidate. He was one of the first people to come out against the Iraq war. And this was still something that now this seems obvious, but this was not a widely held view in the Democratic Party back in 2003. And took some real guts and he started to get a lot of interest among primary voters. So when I joined, he was just starting to hit that wave where he started to hit. And so we went from a team of two and then team of three in the communications team to meet. I had, I think, almost a dozen direct reports. I had a whole communications operation that grew up under me. this is my first job out of college,
Right.
you know? And, I was like a manager right away. And I just learned a lot about, I think, a couple of different things. One was you understood that what you were trying to communicate and the simplicity with which one communicated it really mattered. Like it was the current media environment is like 100 times faster. But even then, you would have this like classic experience of you're either with the candidate or you're doing something else. And like your goal for the day is to talk about healthcare. And you get like the fifth question and it's on something totally different. And they talk about that. And that's like the headline the next day. And because I did communications as my first job, I was just a lot more sympathetic to the role of communication staffers throughout the rest of my career, which is it's a hard job. It's a hard job to actually be able to explain a really complicated idea to a busy reporter. It's really hard to actually have the story focus on the thing that you were trying to have the story focus on versus the 100 other things that happened. And being able to write crisply and effectively just makes a ton of difference. And we would work on that a ton. And then the other thing that we would just do is like how to make it interesting. Like how did it tie into something that is already happening so that it doesn't seem totally random. So I, the the job had one of those elements where we were doing everything from running an operation where we were collecting. This is back in the day where you actually picked up all the newspapers and cut them out and created like a clicks packet. It's like,
Right.
it feel like eons ago, as well as like we would send people out to record all the other candidates and collect the audio and have someone listen to the audio and see if they said anything that was interesting or might be interesting in the media, to responding to the huge amounts of questions that we were getting from the media on different positions, as well as trying to drive whatever we were trying to push on the message. But it gave me the political bug. And as I've continued to do work since then, I've been a lot more open to thinking about the communications elements of the work compared to most of my peers.
Yeah. And as you emphasized, just the speed. Yes, it was a while back, but political campaigns have their own tempo that most people just aren't familiar with. And doing all these different things in real time, best laid plans getting pushed to the side if something random happens somewhere else. All those aspects to allow the agility that you pointed out, such a great skill to have. After you made your way to the Obama administration and you helped shape science and technology policy priorities, as I mentioned, in the White House for nearly 8 years, I'm wondering, what lessons or principles from your earlier experiences in communications did you find particularly useful in the science policy area as you were moving over to OSTP?
Yeah, life always makes more sense in retrospect, but it ended up being very useful. One of my roles when I was in OSTP was I was often the kind of partner with a lot of our top researchers that had come on tour to OSTP on some signature initiative that they wanted to do that was at the presidential level, something that might involve the president giving a speech or anything else. But none of that was guaranteed. All the policy councils are working on different things. There's a huge interest in having your issue be something that rises the level of getting the vice president, the president's interest, or triggering a major event or announcement. And one of the things so I became somebody who was very good at that. And so I was the go-to person from every major science and tech initiative on that kind of like, how do we think about how to make it more salient? And and I worked really closely with the OSCP comms team on that. One of the things that I realized was most of the time for policy people, you spend a lot of time sweating the details to make sure the policy is correct. If we're going to launch a big effort on what are we doing on antimicrobial resistance, you want to actually think hard about what does the space need? How are we going to deal with the market failure problems as to why the problem exists? But from a communication standpoint, one of the things I realized was a lot of times they're actually solving for something different. It's not that they disagree with the policy being important, but the thing that they're trying to figure out is what will the president do and what will the event look like? Can they visualize what this will look like? And often policy people would show up with a 10-page document. Here's what we're going to announce. And you can just see that the communication person is trying to visualize what is this? What are we going to do to bring this idea to life? So I would be the policy staffer that would show up with photos. I would be like, this is the president standing in front of the world's largest wind turbine. And we're going to show the place that manufactures it. And we're going to talk about the future of renewable energy using wind. Okay. They can visualize what that looks like. Or this is a factory walk where every spot that they stop by is some new technology and how many jobs it's going to create. And this kind of sounds obvious, but like most of the time, policy ideas do not come with, well, here's what the visual would be. And it made all the difference. We had the president go out to Carnegie Mellon and give a big speech on advanced manufacturing, where he was meeting with a union member that showed him, this is the robot that we drop into the sewer to look for where the blockage is. And it was like, how can technology actually help empower workers rather than disempower workers? We had the president look at a DARPA car, a car that was actually built from the ground up using, which is a big area around how can the DoD do procurement in a different way. But all these like important ideas, we actually presented through visuals. What could the president look at that brings this idea to life? And that's one thing that I really honed in on and realized. And so that was actually the impetus behind the White House Science Fair. We said, hey, one of the big ideas was the president, he was a real geek, made him a real pleasure to work with. He really, at a core level, loved science and technology, loved thinking about the idea that we were investing in the future, that bets would pay off over a long time. But one of the things that he really wanted was to really think about the next generation. How do we get this generation of kids excited about math and science in the future? But how do you bring that idea to life beyond just him saying it? And so this was, the communications folks are like, what would this look like? What does him exciting the next generation look like? And so I proposed the idea of we could have a science fair, which I don't think we really knew. It was like just a sentence in a speech. And I'm going to host a science fair at the White House. And then out of that came something that we basically did every year. It was one of his favorite events, got a huge amount of coverage, but also was the fulcrum for every year, a lot of both work that the agency were doing to advance STEM education and the broader community. And so it just led to a ton of work, whether it's getting 100,000 math and science teachers trained, which was a 10-year goal that we announced and then recently accomplished. So that aspect of like how to use the communications architecture, the events, the speeches, the visuals, in purpose of the really important policy work that's happening, and not to treat the communications piece of this like afterthought, was something that I realized. And it actually, what I would always tell our folks is that it'll actually help us get even more work done. But we have to be empathetic towards the hard job that the communications team has and try to not make them guess and try to at least come up with some idea. Like I would always say, we should always have at least 5 places the president could go that are not in DC that shows your portfolio coming to life. And you should have that list always ready, because this happens all the time in the building. They'd be like, oh, we're planning a trip. You have in the next few hours, send us some ideas for possible trip locations. And often if you go to the person who does advanced manufacturing and you say, do you have any ideas? Can I get back to you next week? And I would say, no, you cannot get back to me next week. So there's one of the things you learn in politics is you need to give me the answer right away, but the questions are always the same. So you can actually guess what the question will be. Someone is at some point going to say, hey, do you have a couple of bullets on this? So why don't you just write the bullets of what you're working on? If somebody might say, hey, if we could go somewhere to see this, where would you recommend? If somebody said, what are 3 factoids that will really, really convince somebody that this is important? What's a story that would really bring this issue to life? Like those 5 or 6 things you have on the thing you work on, you do pretty well. Like nobody's going to ask you. Most 80 to 90% of requests will fall into one of those categories. So I always told our people, it's like, you won't feel jammed if you just do the pre-work.
So smart and such great advice. And a few things that I noticed there, Kumar. One is you were really like the translator, like the bridge between the policy folks and the communications folks. because you had been a communications person under a really intense spotlight of the New Hampshire primary when Howard Dean was running for president. So I'm sure that gave you also some street cred with the comms folks, but you could also talk the language of your team, of your policy people who had these great ideas. And doing this sort of pre-work that you describe is just so vital. And then sometimes it helps you even understand the topic a little better because you have to put yourself in the seat or the shoes, I should say, of the recipient of the information and try to do that with a little bit of a beginner's mindset. So just great advice for people listening who want to, like you say, bring their work to life so that others can understand and then broaden their impact as a result of that. Just excellent stuff. And so I want to build on that by asking right now, you're in the middle of many science and technology policies, but from a different vantage point at Schmidt Futures. Can you share with listeners a bit about your work and perhaps the role of science and how you perform your leadership role right now?
Yeah, no, of course. I had the privilege when I was coming out of the White House. So I left in the end of 2016 and was starting to figure out what I would do next. And I was really motivated to continue to do the work around work that sat at the intersection between science, technology, and the public good. And I had the benefit of starting to work with Eric as he was starting his sort of thinking on this, especially after Google. And Futures is a pretty young organization. It actually formed in the fall of 2017. And it focuses a lot on how do we actually invest in scientific and technical talent at key points in their career and motivate them to do the most amount of impact. So we have a program called Rise, which is focused on 15 to 17-year-olds. We have what we call an APM program, Associate Product Manager program, but in the social sector, where folks with a strong technical background, right after they graduate from college, will spend 2 years with us and we'll actually deploy them into forward-leaning nonprofits and other work where they can build technical products for the social good. We have a postdoc program for called Schmidt Science Fellows that takes folks in one science background and gives them a chance to do a postdoc in a totally different field. We have a mid-career program called Innovation Fellows. And just last week, we announced a quad fellowship where we are going to help organize amazing students from 4 different countries, the US, Japan, Australia, and India on fellowships in the United States. So a lot of the work that we do is saying we're living in a scientific age, whether it's COVID, whether it's what's happening in climate, a whole number of our global challenges will require scientific and technical solutions. And how can we invest in people at key points in their career in ways that motivates them to have the biggest public impact that they can have? And a lot of the to-do list I carried from my White House days, where what you often find is that small amounts of catalytic support can make a huge difference. And we are often just looking for ideas that are early, but that could be really high potential. So I'll give an example. So there's one of the people that we work with is Elon Gurr, and Elon runs an organization called Activate. And what the key thesis is that there are amazing PhD students that have worked on some technical topic, take battery technology or something else. But by the time they're finishing their PhD, they're actually onto something really promising, but it's not yet something that you could build a company around or something else. And so what Activate does is that it solicits proposals from these PhD students as they're graduating and gives them 2 years of fellowship support, treats them as entrepreneurial scientists and says, here's 2 years of support to keep building out your idea to see if it's the next big thing. And what they found is that 2 years of extra bid support, they don't take any piece of the company. They just are saying, continue to work on your project, ends up being quite transformational. And so they've had that first batch of early companies, projects that they've supported become actual companies, and they've raised more than $500 million in follow-on investment. The actual amount that Elon is betting on them is pretty small. It just helps them keep going. And so it's that permission capital, right? Giving somebody the support so they can keep working on the thing that they find the most exciting, that could have the biggest impact on the world, makes a lot of difference. And so a lot of Schmidt Futures programs are designed with trying to find those important if true ideas and saying, if somebody was betting on that idea in a big way, how could it have the biggest impact? And that ends up, it's very informed by my view in government, which is government is actually a pretty big investor in R&D, right? So the federal government, the US government alone spends almost $180 billion a year on R&D. There are still gaps as to how do you those resources. And if you can provide a little bit of early support to let interesting new ideas to come in, that can have a big impact in being able to accelerate the impact of that R&D.
Yeah, so true. Just that kind of that critical point. And we'll have links to all of these programs and of course for Schmidt Futures and all of those things for listeners who are interested in this really exciting information that you're sharing and this diversity of different programs that may be suitable for some folks who are listening to apply. I want to ask you, Kumar, working with scientists, you really were immersed in the world of science, obviously at OSTP, as well as the world of policy. And I'm wondering, in your current role, in your role at the White House, are there certain skills and attributes that you've found certain scientists possess that sets them apart, could help them be more effective? And you talked about the idea of thinking visually and thinking about the questions that you may be asked to really distill and boil down, maybe in that vein or other ideas that you have for listeners who are intrigued and fascinated about what you're talking about and might think, how could I prepare for a role like the ones that you've been describing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that in some ways, none of this is hard, but just takes some practice. And here's what I mean, which is the I had a, one of the things I realized when I was in government, for example, is that most of the researchers I met had been trained to spend a lot of time getting very smart on a very narrow thing and being the leading world expert on that topic. So that might have taken them 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And then someone said, here's a different thing. Can you tell me what we should do on it? And I would like you to give me an answer in 3 days. And that feels like a really strong narrative violation compared to what they think expertise building looks like, because they actually are an expert and it took them a huge amount of dedicated work to get to that. The thing that I would always say to them is you actually have a lot of the tools to rapidly apply what you have already become an expert in onto something new. And it is not like government is going to wait. So if you don't answer the question, somebody else will, and they'll be even less adept to answer it. Or you might be able to figure out who is the expert on it and get them on the phone much faster than someone else. So I think one is just the ability to operate in an environment which requires a good degree of speed and being able to answer the question at a level of specificity, but not where you necessarily have the answer all the way down the stack. I think that takes a little bit of just comfort and practice, but I think it's something that researchers can really master. It's just not in their usual experience set. I think the second one is that you really have to write for the reader, which is I often find that somebody will say, I wrote a paper on this. And then that's their definition of policy advocacy. And what they have not done is thought about the fact that they might be sending this to a very busy policymaker and they're just not going to click on the link. And instead, if you had said, I've interviewed 100 different people and I have 3 key recommendations. Here they are. Here's a link for more information. You are way more likely to have them absorb what you did and then follow up if they have questions. And so understanding that most people in policymaking have suffered from cognitive overload, and that if you take the steps to put it in the right context and give them what the military calls bluff, bottom line up front, you are way more likely to have an impact. And then I would just say that a certain amount of this is just what I just call policy entrepreneurship, which is for things that you're motivated on. I don't subscribe to the kind of I'm putting something into the air theory of change. Like I published an op-ed, I put it into the world, I think all this is a iterative exercise. You send somebody something, you say, hey, let me know if you have any questions. If they have questions, you get back to them. That's how big things happen. It doesn't take actually that much interactions for you to level up somebody. But I have found that the people who are willing to have that sort of flexible mindset, they might be expert in one thing, but they have to get better at these other things. They have, and that curiosity and eagerness to thrive at those things. You can actually be extremely influential in policy world because policymakers are often lacking for that technical depth. So if you can actually meet them where they are, which is you can actually give them succinct answers quickly on the thing in ways that they can process, they will keep coming back to you. And your ability to have an impact is actually quite substantial. It's just, you have to do a little bit of that work and get practice doing that work. And there's lots of organizations that can help coach. We've done things with, for example, the Day One Project to run short papers that are policy ready. But there's a lot. If you can get a chance to do a tour of duty, do a fellowship or use the Intergovernmental Personnel Act when you have a sabbatical year to spend a year in government. These are actually quite straightforward to master. It can make a huge difference, but they just don't at all follow I wrote a paper and I presented at a conference model of impact, because nobody that you're trying to influence is there when it comes to the broader policy world. And they just won't read it if you don't tell them why they should read it.
Yeah, so true. And you touched on a couple of things that are just so important, including what the definition of expert is in these two different universes. The definition of expert in the policy area is so quite different. Obviously, you don't have 10, 15 years to be able to master something to the expert level that would be considered in academia, but being flexible like that. And of course, the more you are engaging in other issues, the more patterns that you see and the more you're able to quickly shift. So just great advice there. And Kumar, as we wrap up and you look towards the future, you pointed out some of the really pressing, I don't like to be dramatic, but like existential issues, climate change, obviously with COVID and future public health challenges. I'm wondering what emerging trends you or would like to see and you're working to advance. As you pointed out, you don't just put something out there in the world. If you want to make a difference, that's only the beginning. Follow up. But maybe what kind of trends in terms of scientists getting involved in policymaking or in the communication of scientific information to general audiences?
Yeah, I think that we are profound moment. I think partly we're in a profound moment because there aren't that many generational moments where everybody lives through the same thing and has that shared context. And certainly COVID and a number of related things are giving us that shared moment. Many things that we took for granted, like our ability to respond to these crises, has been shaken. But at the same time, science has really delivered on lots of things, such as a vaccine schedule, development schedule that no one expected was possible. So we are both failing at basic things, but then also are capable of incredible things if we put our mind to it. So I think it's a real call to the scientific community to say, this is not going to happen if we stick to ourselves and wait for the world to catch up. Direct engagement is going to really matter. And I think that actually can happen in a lot of ways. And I think the thing that I would really emphasize to people, partly because I was in these sort of policy roles, is that impact is a context sport, right? Like you're not going to get it by writing into the air. Just showing up, take whether it's city government, whether it's state government, whether it's national, do a tour of duty, raise your hand to serve, take many of these different policy fellowships, write your policy paper down and ask for feedback. Any of these steps you take actually makes the whole country and the whole world smarter, because you're actually taking that step and it will be very activating for you. So my only sort of request for everyone listening is to think of one active way they want to get involved, and whether, I'm sure you'd be happy to help them and I'm happy to be a resource, but think about some idea that you think would be really important, that if you saw that you want to advocate for, and think about what would be the tools and how to get it there. And there's lots of people who can coach you. But so many things I've worked on came from a single person I talked to that said, how come we're not investing these dollars into increasing broadband into schools? Or why aren't we working on this? And they would develop that idea and then it would actually get traction. And then I met somebody during the 2020 cycle that had very specific idea for why can't we get more computer science taught into ROTC programs, the ROTC programs. So that's like a major initiative by DoD now, that embed computer science and cyber into the ROTC programs. And that was like an idea and it's now like getting done, right? So the big thing I would just sort of emphasize to people is the amount of things that are changeable in the world are more than you think, but they're not going to happen automatically. They're going to require small amounts of your time to nudge and push them forward in the world. So I encourage people to do it.
And those will be the last words for the interview. Kumar Garg, such an inspiring, energetic, optimistic conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I know our listeners will as well.
Thank you so much.
Listeners, thank you for being aboard on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.